My daughter called me at 2 in the morning from the police station. Not from her cell phone, from a landline there, the kind with a number I didn't recognize, so I almost didn't pick up. I remember looking at the screen in the dark of my bedroom, thinking it was a telemarketer with bad timing. Then something in my gut said answer it, and I did, and I heard her voice, Claire, 17 years old, whispering so quietly I had to press the phone hard against my ear just to catch the words. At whatever you do, don't go home. I didn't panic. I've learned over the years that panic is a luxury I can't always afford, especially when my daughter needs me to be the steady one. So I sat up in bed, turned on the lamp, and asked her one question. Why? A pause. Then so softly I almost missed it. Because the detectives are there with a warrant for, and then she stopped, and I could hear something in the background, a door, a voice, and she said, I have to go, Dad, just don't go home. Please? Then the line went dead. Some people, when I tell them this story, say I should have called 911 immediately. Others say I should have driven straight home and confronted whoever was there. My mother, and I'll get to my mother, says I should have called her first. But the truth is, when I sat in that rented hotel room at 2 in the morning with my daughter's whispered warning still hanging in the air, the first person I called was my attorney. Let me tell you how we got here. Because this story doesn't start at the police station. It starts about 3 years before that phone call, at a family dinner I almost didn't attend. To understand what happened that night at my childhood home, and what happened in the weeks that followed, you need to understand my family. Not the version of my family that shows up in Christmas cards, the one with matching outfits and wide smiles. I mean the real architecture of it. Who holds the power, who pretends not to, and what everyone stands to gain or lose. My name is Nora Scott. I am 41 years old. I have one daughter, Claire, from my marriage to a man named Daniel Reyes, whom I divorced 9 years ago. Daniel and I are on civil terms now, mostly for Claire's sake, and he was out of the country on a work assignment when that 2 in the morning call came in. My mother, Beverly Scott, lives in the house I grew up in, a four-bedroom colonial in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio that she has occupied with increasing territorial intensity ever since my father passed away 6 years ago. My younger brother, Garrett Scott, lives 12 minutes from that house with his wife, Lena, and their two boys. He has always been my mother's favorite, a fact that neither of them has ever been discreet about. And then there is my mother's sister, my Aunt Diane, Diane Holloway, who is not technically a villain in this story, but who has spent the better part of 2 decades making small, consistent choices that have always, somehow, landed in a way that benefited Garrett at my expense. I used to think it was unconscious. I stopped thinking that around the time I turned 34. The family gathering where this all began was a Saturday evening in October, 3 years before the phone call. My mother had asked everyone to come for what she described as a family dinner, but what turned out to be something considerably more consequential. I drove the 2 hours from my apartment in Cincinnati with Claire, who was 14 at the time and already better at reading a room than most adults I know. She squeezed my hand in the driveway before we went in. It feels like something, she said. I know, I said. Are you okay? I told her I was, and I mostly was. But I had been building something quietly for almost 2 years by that point, and I had learned to keep my face neutral in situations where my instincts were telling me to pay close attention. What I had been building was not a secret business empire. I want to be clear about that, because the temptation in stories like this is to reveal that the woman everyone underestimated had been secretly running a company worth millions. That's not what I was. What I was, professionally, was a licensed family law attorney. I had been practicing for 11 years. I had a modest but growing client base in Cincinnati, a solid reputation in the community, and as of about 22 months before that October dinner, a very specific and deliberate legal strategy for protecting my daughter's financial future in the event that certain members of my family decided to do what I had begun to suspect they were considering. That suspicion had started quietly. A comment here, a question there. The way my mother had stopped asking about my practice and started asking, with unusual frequency, about my grandmother's estate. My grandmother, Ruth Scott, had passed away 4 years earlier, leaving behind a modest estate that included a house in rural Kentucky that had been in the family for nearly 60 years, a small investment account, and the part nobody ever liked to mention directly, a handwritten amendment to her, will that her original attorney, a man named Gerald Foss who had since retired to Florida, had drafted for her in the last year of her life. That amendment named Claire as a secondary beneficiary of the Kentucky property, behind my mother, with a specific clause that read, and I had reviewed this document more times than I can count, that if the property were ever sold, 15% of the net proceeds would be held in trust for Claire until she turned 25. 15% of the Kentucky property's assessed value, at the time of my grandmother's death, was approximately $41,000. That number had grown since then. The property had been appraised again 18 months before the October dinner at an assessed value that put Claire's share at roughly $63,000. Nobody in my family ever mentioned that amendment directly to me. But I had noticed over the preceding year that the conversations around my grandmother's estate had become quieter, more careful, and that my mother had hired a new estate attorney, not Gerald Foss, who was retired and out of reach, but a younger man named Kevin Tran, whose office was in the same building as Garrett's financial planning firm. I had noted the date I first became aware of Kevin Tran's involvement, February 9th, 2 years before the October dinner. I had noted it because I immediately called my own attorney the following morning. Her name is Linda Ackheffer. She has been practicing estate and family law in Cincinnati for 19 years, and she has the particular quality that I most value in a legal professional, which is that she does not waste words. When I told her what I suspected, that my family might be attempting to quietly restructure my grandmother's estate in a way that would diminish or eliminate Claire's inheritance, Linda listened without interrupting, asked four precise questions, and then said, "Get me copies of everything you have. We will file a formal notice of interest with the probate court." We did that on February 12th. My family had no idea. If you have ever been counted out by someone who should have known better, you know exactly what that silence feels like. The silence of knowing something that the people underestimating you don't know you know. It is not comfortable, but it is useful. The pattern in my family had always been the same, and I had stopped being surprised by it years before I started being strategic about it. When I graduated from law school, my mother had taken Garrett out to dinner to celebrate his promotion at the bank. When I passed the bar, she had sent me a card with a $20 gift card to a bookstore tucked inside. When I opened my own practice, she had told me, very seriously, that she was worried I was overextending myself and that I should consider going back to work for a firm where I would have more security. I remember that conversation because I had been sitting at my desk when she called, and I had just gotten off the phone with a client whose retainer fee had covered my operating expenses for the next 3 months. I didn't correct her. I thanked her for her concern and told her I was managing carefully. Garrett, meanwhile, had borrowed $40,000 from my mother 4 years prior to open his financial planning practice, a loan that had never been formally repaid and that my mother referred to, when she referred to it at all, as help I gave both my children equally, which was not accurate. The help she had given me, across my entire adult life, amounted to a check for $500 when Claire was born and the occasional bag of groceries left on my doorstep when she happened to be passing through Cincinnati. I did not resent this exactly. I had built my practice on my own, and there was a quiet satisfaction in that which my mother's bookstore gift card had never diminished. But I was not naive about what it meant. When my family looked at me, they saw the daughter who was getting by, who was managing, who was doing fine but not spectacularly. They had no particular reason to question that picture, because I had no particular reason to correct it. What they didn't know, what I had been careful to keep private, was that 18 months before that October dinner, I had taken on a major corporate client through a referral from a colleague. The case had involved a complicated custody and asset protection dispute for a high net worth family, and it had taken 11 months to resolve. The legal fees from that single case had allowed me to do three things: pay off the remaining balance on my practice's operating loan, establish a 529 education account for Claire with an initial deposit of $65,000, and hire a forensic accountant named James Whitfield to begin a quiet, thorough review of my grandmother's estate records. James had come to me through Linda Ackheffer's referral. He was methodical, private, and expensive. He had been working for me for about 6 months by the time of the October dinner, and he had already found two things that I considered significant. The first was a discrepancy in the accounting of the estate's investment account, a withdrawal of $11,000 in the month following my grandmother's death, coded in the estate records as administrative expenses, for which there was no corresponding invoice or receipt. Second was a document that had been filed with the county clerk's office in Kentucky, not the probate court, but the county clerk, that appeared to be a deed modification for the rural property. It had been filed quietly, without notice to me or to Claire's interest, and it bore the signature of Kevin Tran as the filing attorney. I had reviewed that document on a Thursday afternoon, alone in my office after my last client of the day had left. I sat with it for a long time. Then I called Linda. "Is this what I think it is?" I asked her. It appears to be an attempt to restructure the property's ownership chain, she said. Whether it is legally effective is a separate question, but you need to act quickly. We began preparing the formal challenge that same week. None of this was visible to my family. To them, I was Nora who drove a 7-year-old Subaru and lived in a mid-sized apartment and occasionally mentioned that work was going well. To them, I was the daughter who had never quite landed on solid ground after the divorce, who was raising Claire mostly alone, who sent reasonable Christmas gifts and showed up to family dinners without making trouble. I had been content to let them think that, partly because correcting people's assumptions costs energy I preferred to spend elsewhere, partly because my daughter's financial future depended on nobody alerting my family to the fact that I was watching, but mostly because I had learned, after 11 years of practicing family law, that the best time to reveal what you know is not when your opponent is comfortable. It's when they've already committed. The October dinner was a Saturday. I arrived with Claire at 6 in the evening, and I could tell within 4 minutes of walking through the door that something had been decided before we got there. My mother was wearing the expression she wears when she has information she is managing, a particular quality of brightness, too deliberate to be natural. Garrett was at the kitchen island with a glass of wine, and he looked at me when I came in with the slightly too casual face of a man who has rehearsed his composure. Lena, his wife, gave me a genuine hug. Whatever else I can say about Lena, she has never been unkind to me personally. She is the kind of woman who goes along with things because she has decided that her marriage requires it, and I have never held that against her, even when it cost me. Aunt Diane was already seated at the dining room table when we came through, and she gave me the particular smile she reserves for moments when she feels confident, a smile that, over the years, I had come to think of as her filing cabinet smile, the one she puts on when she believes everything is already sorted and in order. Claire went upstairs to the guest room to charge her phone, and I accepted a glass of water from my mother and stood in the kitchen while she moved around making small talk about the drive and the weather and how Claire was looking so grown up. I answered pleasantly and kept my hands relaxed and thought about the document James Whitfield had delivered to my office 4 days earlier, which was now in a sealed envelope in Linda Ockhaffer's office safe. My mother, over dinner, brought up the Kentucky property with the particular sideways approach she uses when she doesn't want to seem like she's raising something important. She mentioned that she had been thinking about the estate and that she had had some conversations with Kevin. She referred to him as Kevin, first name, the way you do with people you've been working with for a while, and that there were some updates to the property situation that she wanted to share with the family. I set my fork down quietly. She explained, in the measured tone of someone delivering news they expect to be received calmly, that the Kentucky property had become something of a burden, the upkeep, the taxes, the distance, and that after careful consideration, she and Garrett had decided it would be best to sell it. She said that Kevin had helped them simplify the ownership structure to make the sale process easier, and that the proceeds would be divided between herself and Garrett as the primary heirs. Aunt Diane nodded. Lena looked at her water glass. Garrett looked at me. I took a breath. I looked at my mother. And then I said very calmly, "When did you file the deed modification?" The brightness in my mother's face shifted, not dramatically, nothing so obvious as a collapse, but something behind her eyes recalibrated, the way a person's expression changes when they realize the conversation is not going where they planned. "I'm not sure what you mean," she said. "The modification filed with the county clerk in Kentucky," I said. "Kevin Tran's signature, filed about 7 months ago. When did that happen?" Garrett set his glass down. He looked at our mother, and in that look was the question he didn't want to ask out loud, which was, how does she know about that? That was the moment I understood with complete clarity that what I had suspected was true. Not because of anything they said, because of what they didn't say. Nobody at that table denied it. Nobody asked me what I was talking about. They just looked at each other with the quiet, careful panic of people who had assumed they were doing something private and had just discovered they were not. I didn't press further that night. I had learned, from a decade of courtrooms and depositions and settlement negotiations, that the moment of exposure is not the moment to push. You let them absorb it. You let them go home and make calls and send messages and try to figure out how much you know. You let them construct their response. And then, when they are confident they have accounted for everything, you show them what they missed. I drove home to Cincinnati with Claire asleep in the passenger seat, and somewhere on the highway in the dark, I called Linda Ockhaffer's voicemail and said, "I think we're on timeline. Let's talk Monday." 3 weeks later, the formal legal challenge to the deed modification was filed in the Kentucky County Court. My mother received the notice on a Thursday morning. Garrett received his copy the same day. Kevin Tran received a separate letter from Linda's office outlining the nature of our concerns about the filing process and requesting a full accounting of all estate transactions since my grandmother's death. I was in a client meeting when my mother called. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message that lasted 4 minutes and 40 seconds, and I listened to it once, took notes on the 3 factual claims she made that I knew to be inaccurate, and forwarded the recording to Linda. The next several months were what I think of as the quiet war. Nothing dramatic happened externally. No screaming phone calls, no confrontations at family gatherings. My mother and I spoke occasionally, with the careful pleasantness of 2 people who are communicating through attorneys and don't want to say anything that can be used against them. Garrett stopped calling altogether. Aunt Diane sent me a text message in January saying she hoped we could find a resolution that works for everyone, which I understood to mean that she had been told things were not going as planned. James Whitfield completed his full forensic review in February, a little over a year after I had hired him, and delivered a 40-page report to Linda's office. The $11,000 withdrawal, coded as administrative expenses, turned out to be the visible edge of a larger pattern. There were 4 additional transactions, smaller, spread across a 14-month period, that James had traced to payments made to an entity that was registered in Garrett's wife's maiden name. Not Lena's name, Lena's mother's maiden name. The kind of detail you only find if you're looking very carefully for a very specific thing. I remember sitting in Linda's conference room when she walked me through the report. I remember the feeling of looking at those pages, not satisfaction, exactly. Something quieter than that, the particular feeling of having suspected something for a long time and finally having the documentation to prove it wasn't in your imagination. This is potentially criminal, Linda said. She didn't say it dramatically. She just stated it the way she states things. I know, I said. Do you want to involve the authorities or do you want to use this as leverage in the civil proceeding? I thought about Claire. I thought about the $63,000 that was supposed to be hers. I thought about my grandmother, who had written that amendment herself in her own handwriting because she wanted to make sure her great-granddaughter was taken care of. I thought about Kevin Tran, who had filed a deed modification he had to have known was problematic, and about the entity registered in Lena's mother's maiden name, and about my mother's 4-minute and 40-second voicemail, and about the way Garrett had looked at her across the dinner table when he realized I knew about the filing. Both, I said. Linda nodded once. I'll contact the Columbus field office Monday morning. Everything I had built over the preceding 2 years was about to be tested. The legal filing was in place. The forensic documentation was complete. The notice of interest was on record. And on the other side, my family had no idea how much of it existed, or how long I had been watching, or that the conversation at the October dinner, the one they thought had gone badly but recoverable, had in fact been the last moment at which any of them could have stopped what was coming. The timing, as it turned out, was not mine to control entirely. Because 2 months after that conversation in Linda's conference room, on a Tuesday evening in early April, my daughter called me from a police station at 2 in the morning and told me not to go home. And the warrant the detectives were at my house to execute had nothing to do with my grandmother's estate. It wasn't about the estate. That was the thing that kept running through my mind as I sat in my car in the hotel parking lot at 2:17 in the morning with my phone pressed against my knee, trying to think clearly. Whatever had brought the detectives to my house, whatever warrant Claire had whispered about before the line cut, it had nothing to do with the Kentucky property or James Whitfield's report or Kevin Tran's filing with the county clerk. That case was entirely civil. What warranted a criminal search warrant was something else. I called Linda's emergency line first. She picked up on the third ring, her voice alert in the way of someone who has spent decades being called at bad hours. Nora, not a question. There are detectives at my house with a warrant. Claire called me from the police station. I don't know the nature of the warrant. A pause, short, professional. Where are you now? Hotel parking lot. I was in Columbus for a deposition tomorrow morning. Don't go home yet. Find out what the warrant is for before you go anywhere near that property. Call the precinct, identify yourself as the homeowner, and ask them directly. You have every right to that information. I did exactly that. I called the Columbus Police Precinct, not the one in my city, but the one in my mother's county, because something in the way Claire had said don't go home had told me this wasn't about my apartment in Cincinnati. It was about my mother's house, or something connected to it. The desk officer was professional and brief. He confirmed there was an active warrant related to a financial crimes investigation. He could not give me details over the phone. He told me that a 17-year-old had been brought in for questioning as a witness, not a suspect, and that she was currently with a juvenile advocate and was free to leave when I arrived to collect her. I was in the car and driving before he finished the sentence. Claire was sitting in a chair beside a desk in the precinct's front area when I walked in, wearing the sweatshirt she'd taken to the family gathering earlier that evening. Because this had started at a family gathering, I should explain that now, because I realize I skipped directly from the phone call, and I owe you the part that came before it. The gathering had been Garrett's birthday dinner. Late April. His 42nd. My mother had hosted it at her house, the same colonial where she had lived since before I could remember, and she had called me 3 weeks earlier to ask if Claire and I would come. She had used the particular tone she uses when she wants something from me, warmer than usual, softer, the tone that means she needs something to look normal. I had agreed. Not because I had forgiven her for the estate situation, the civil proceeding was still active at that point, still moving through the Kentucky court system, and Linda had advised me to maintain cordial family contact to avoid any claim that I had acted in bad faith. But also, honestly, because I wanted to see what she was planning. In my experience, when my mother wants something to look normal, it means something abnormal is already in motion. I brought Claire, who was 17 and old enough to decide for herself whether she wanted to come. She had thought about it for a full day before saying yes. I want to understand what grandma is like, she told me. That sentence stayed with me the whole drive there. The dinner was on a Saturday. Lena had cooked. She is, genuinely, an excellent cook, one of those people whose food makes you feel briefly at peace with everything, which is a complicated quality to have in an antagonist's household. There were 12 people at the table. My mother, Garrett, and Lena, their two boys who were 9 and 12 and fundamentally innocent of any of this, Aunt Diane and her husband Frank, two of Garrett's college friends whose names I did not know well, and Claire and me. It felt, for the first 90 minutes, like a normal dinner. Garrett was charming in the way he always is when he's feeling secure. Lena kept refilling water glasses. Aunt Diane told a long story about a cruise she had been on that nobody fully tracked, but everyone nodded at politely. Claire sat beside me and ate a second helping of the roasted potatoes and answered questions about her junior year with the composed, pleasant manner of someone who has learned that family dinners require a certain kind of performance. I had been watching my mother. Not obviously, I was having conversations, laughing at the right moments, commenting on the food. But I was watching the way you watch something you know is about to move. She waited until dessert. The moment she glanced at Garrett, a small, private glance across the table, the kind that means we're doing this now, I felt the shift before anything happened. I set down my coffee cup very deliberately. My mother folded her hands in front of her plate. There's something I've been wanting to discuss with everyone. She included the whole table in her gaze, which meant she was performing. When my mother actually wanted to talk to everyone, she used the phone. When she wanted an audience for something she had already decided, she used dinner. Garrett nodded once, supportive, prepared. You know I've been dealing with the estate matters. She looked at me briefly, then away. And I've come to a decision about the Kentucky property that I think is best for the family. From across the table, Aunt Diane's husband Frank quietly poured himself more wine. Lena's hand went to the stem of her glass, and she held it without drinking. We've decided to proceed with the sale, my mother continued. And given the complications that have arisen, this was the word she chose for the legal challenge I had filed through Linda, complications, as though it were a scheduling conflict. Kevin has advised us that the cleanest approach is to proceed under the modified ownership structure, which keeps the transaction straightforward. I kept my face neutral. I had known this was coming. I had known it for 6 weeks. What I had not known was what came next. And in terms of Claire's portion, my mother said, and her tone shifted slightly, became quieter, more careful, we've decided that it would be more appropriate for those funds to be redirected into a family educational trust, administered by Garrett, rather than going directly into a third-party account. Given Nora's current legal proceedings, we think it's more stable. My current legal proceedings. She meant the challenge I had filed. She was using my own legal action as the reason to move Claire's inheritance further out of reach. I looked at my mother for a long moment, then I looked at Claire. Claire was looking at her plate. Her face was very still. She was 17 years old and smart enough to understand exactly what had just been said, and she was not going to cry at the dinner table, because she is her mother's daughter, and we do not do that. That was the moment I stopped being strategic about the timeline. Not because of what my mother had said to me, because of the way Claire's face went still. Because of the particular way a 17-year-old who has been trying very hard to be mature absorbs a cruelty delivered in the language of practicality. Because my daughter had driven 2 hours to try to understand what her grandmother was like, and what she had learned, over a plate of roasted potatoes, was this. I excused myself from the table. I walked to the hallway, took out my phone, and called Linda. She picked up after 2 rings. File everything, I said. Emergency injunction to freeze the property sale. Tonight if you can reach the duty judge, tomorrow morning first thing if not. A brief pause. Something happened. They announced they're redirecting Claire's trust to Garrett's administration. They're using my legal filing as justification. I heard Linda's pen stop on paper. Then, I'll have the injunction application ready by 6 tomorrow morning. The sale cannot proceed. Do you want to serve notice tonight? Tomorrow, I said. Tonight I need to go back to that table and not let anyone know this call happened. I went back to the table. I picked up my coffee. I asked Garrett's friend, his name was David. I remembered that now, whether he had been following the playoff games. The conversation moved. My mother watched me with the expression of someone who expected a reaction and was uncertain about the absence of one. What happened next is not something I planned, and it is not something I am entirely proud of, but I am telling it accurately. Garrett, emboldened by my apparent calm, leaned back in his chair and made a comment that I think he believed was under his breath and was not. He said to Lena, quietly but not quietly enough, that he had expected more of a scene and that it was good she was finally learning to be reasonable. Claire heard it. I know she heard it because her fork went very still for exactly 2 seconds. She didn't say anything. She put her fork down, excused herself from the table, and went upstairs. She was upstairs for about 20 minutes. I did not follow her immediately because I needed to give myself time to keep my composure, and also because what was happening at that table was still giving me information. Aunt Diane, in the silence after Claire left, said quietly to my mother, "Beverly, maybe this isn't the night." My mother looked at her sister and said nothing. When I went upstairs to find Claire, she wasn't in the guest room. She wasn't in the bathroom. I found her in my mother's home office, standing beside the desk, holding a manila folder. She looked up when I came in, and her expression was something I had never seen on her face before, not upset, not angry, but very, very focused. "Mom," she said, "I think you need to look at this." The folder was not labeled. Inside were what appeared to be photocopies of financial transfers, bank records, formatted in the particular way that institutional accounts produce them. I have reviewed enough financial documents in my legal career to recognize account statements when I see them. These were transfers from the estate account, not the $11,000 James Whitfield had already found. These were newer, more of them. And one of them, the most recent, dated less than 30 days ago, was a transfer of $28,000 to an account number I didn't recognize, with a memo line that said simply, "Closing costs." There was no property closing. The injunction hadn't been filed yet. There was nothing to close. I stood in my mother's home office with that folder in my hands and understood, with the particular cold clarity of a lawyer looking at financial records, that someone had already begun moving money. Not planning to move it, had moved it. I took photographs of every document in the folder with my phone. I put the folder back exactly as Claire had found it. I took my daughter's hand and we walked downstairs together. We said our goodbyes within 15 minutes. I cited an early morning, which was true. I had a deposition in Columbus. My mother hugged me at the door with the bright, careful smile. Garrett walked us to the car. He leaned against the door frame while Claire got in, and he looked at me with an expression I can only describe as satisfied. "Good to see you, Nora," he said. "You too, Garrett." I got in the car. I drove us to a hotel 12 minutes from my mother's house because the deposition was early and the drive back to Cincinnati was too long. Claire was asleep by 10:30. I lay in the dark for 2 hours thinking about those bank records, about the account number I didn't recognize, about the words closing costs on a transaction with no closing. At 2 in the morning, my phone rang from the precinct. The transfer of $28,000, as it turned out, had come from an account Claire had. Not the 529 account I had established for her, the one in my name as custodian, which Linda had helped me structure carefully and which was untouchable. This was a different account. A custodial savings account that my grandmother had opened for Claire when Claire was 4 years old, listing my mother, Beverly, as the secondary custodian in the event of Nora's incapacitation. That designation had never been updated because I had never known it existed. My grandmother had opened it quietly, as a gift, and had never mentioned it to me. My mother had known about it. She had accessed it 12 days ago, transferred $28,000 out of my daughter's account, and routed it to an account associated with the entity registered in Lena's mother's maiden name, the same entity James Whitfield had already identified in his forensic report. The detectives at my house were not there because of the civil proceeding. They were there because James Whitfield, in the course of completing his audit and preparing the final documentation for our legal challenge, had identified the withdrawal from Claire's custodial account and had, because he is a forensic accountant with professional obligations I had not fully anticipated, flagged it to the State Financial Crimes Unit. He had done this without informing me first, because he believed, correctly, that it met the threshold for mandatory reporting. The warrant was for records. Not for my arrest, not for Claire's, for the financial records in my mother's home office. The same office where Claire had found that folder 2 hours earlier. If you're still with me, stay, because what happened next is the reason this story matters. I arrived at the precinct at 2:43 in the morning. Claire stood up when she saw me come through the door, and she crossed the room and put her arms around me, and I held her for a long time without saying anything. She smelled like the hotel shampoo and the night air, and faintly, still, like Lena's cooking. I didn't touch anything else, she said against my shoulder, just the folder. I know. I pulled back and looked at her. You did the right thing. Is Grandma going to get arrested? I thought about how to answer that honestly. I don't know yet, that's not our decision. A detective named Ramirez, young, careful, with the patient manner of someone who had learned to be precise, spoke with me for 40 minutes. I gave him everything I had, the photographs from my phone. James Whitfield's contact information. Linda Ockheffer's contact information. The account number I had photographed from the transfer document. He listened without interrupting, asked clean questions, and at the end told me that the investigation would proceed independently of my civil case, and that I should have my attorney contact the Financial Crimes Unit in the morning. We left the precinct at Fort Welve in the morning. I drove us back to the hotel. Claire slept, I didn't. By 6:15, Linda had the injunction application filed. By 7, she had been briefed on the criminal element. By 8:30, I was in my deposition, a completely unrelated case, a custody matter for a client who had nothing to do with any of this, and I sat across from opposing counsel and answered questions with the focused clarity of someone who had not slept and was running entirely on consequence. The formal confrontation with my family did not happen at a dinner table. I had spent enough of my life at family dinner tables. It happened 3 weeks later, in a conference room at Linda Ockheffer's office in Cincinnati, on a Thursday morning in May. My mother arrived with Kevin Tran. Garrett arrived with a lawyer I didn't recognize, young, slightly nervous, an associate from a Columbus firm who I suspected had not been fully briefed on the scope of what he was walking into. I was already seated when they came in. Linda was beside me. James Whitfield was at the end of the table with a 12-page summary of his findings tabbed and organized into 4 sections. I had a glass of water and nothing else on the table in front of me. My mother came in first. She saw me sitting there and something moved across her face, a flicker of something that was almost a flinch, quickly controlled. She sat across from me. Garrett sat beside her. Kevin Tran sat at the far end, near his client, with the posture of a man who has recently had a very difficult conversation with his own malpractice carrier. Garrett's lawyer, his name was Brennan, I learned later, first year out of law school, set a leather notebook on the table and uncapped a pen with the particular energy of someone compensating for uncertainty with preparation. Linda opened the meeting with a brief statement of scope. She laid out what we were there to discuss: the fraudulent deed modification, the improperly redirected estate funds, the withdrawal from Claire's custodial account, and the related criminal investigation that was now operating independently of this proceeding. My mother, at the word criminal, looked at Kevin Tran. Kevin Tran looked at the table. We are prepared to discuss a resolution, Kevin said. His voice was even, professional, but there was a quality in it, a careful flatness, that I recognized as the tone of someone who knows that what they've done cannot be undone and is now purely in damage control mode. Linda set a copy of James Whitfield's summary in front of each person at the table. Let's begin with the estate account transactions, she said. Mr. Whitfield, will you take us through section 1? James opened his copy. He does not have a dramatic voice. He is a quiet man, methodical, the kind of person whose precision is more effective than any theatrics. He began to walk through the transactions, one by one, with dates, amounts, and account routing numbers. My mother sat very still through the first page. She had the posture of someone waiting for a moment that does not come, the moment when the information turns out to be less complete than feared. Page 1 ended. Page 2 began. Garrett leaned forward about halfway through the second page. These are estate administration costs, he said. The confidence in his voice was real but thin, the kind that comes from having said something often enough that it starts to feel true. Kevin documented all of these. James looked at him over the summary. The documentation provided to the probate court reflects $11,200 in administrative expenses across 14 months. The transactions I've identified total $47,800. The difference of $36,600 has no corresponding documentation filed with the court. Garrett opened his mouth, closed it, Brennan, the young lawyer, wrote something in his notebook. There's an explanation for that, Kevin Tran said. He didn't give the explanation. He just stated that one existed with the tone of a man buying time. I'd like to hear it, Linda said pleasantly. A pause, 4 full seconds in which nobody spoke. Kevin looked at his client. My mother was looking at her copy of the summary. She had turned to the third page, and she was looking at something there. I knew what it was, because I had reviewed the document the night before. Section 3 was the part about Claire's custodial account. The withdrawal, the routing, the entity registered in Lena's mother's maiden name. When she looked up, her expression was different. The bright, controlled quality she had worn at the dinner table, the performance of a woman who had arranged things to her satisfaction, was gone. What was underneath it was older, something more like grief, or the cousin of grief that arrives when you understand that the thing you did is not going to be what you thought it was. How did you get these? Her voice was quiet, not angry, genuinely asking. I hired a forensic accountant 18 months ago, I said, when I became aware that the estate records were being modified without notice to me as an interested party. She looked at me for a long moment. You've been building this. I've been protecting my daughter's inheritance, I said. That's the same thing. Garrett pushed back from the table slightly, not standing, just creating distance from the documents, a physical instinct. You're taking this completely out of context, Nora. We were restructuring to simplify Linda set a document in front of him. This is the deed modification filed with the county clerk in Kentucky. The filing uses a property description that excludes the amendment clause from Ruth Scott's original will, the clause that names Claire as a secondary beneficiary. The exclusion was not an error. The same language appears in 3 subsequent documents prepared by Mr. Tran's office. She looked at Kevin. I'd be interested to know at what point your client instructed you to remove that clause. Kevin Tran put his pen down. He did not pick it up again for the rest of the meeting. We should take a brief recess, Garrett's lawyer said. He leaned toward Garrett and spoke quietly, too quietly for me to hear, but I could see Garrett's face during whatever was being said, and I watched the remaining confidence leave it the way color drains from something in cold water, slowly from the edges in. We can take 5 minutes, Linda agreed. In those 5 minutes, I stood up and walked to the window. Linda stood beside me. She said nothing. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been established in the documents on the table. When everyone reconvened, Garrett's lawyer spoke first. My client would like to discuss a path to resolution. With respect to the estate funds, before we discuss resolution, I said, I want to address Section 4 of Mr. Whitfield's report, which concerns my daughter's custodial account. Brennan glanced at the summary. He had not got to Section 4. I looked at my mother. On April 9th, you withdrew $28,000 from a custodial savings account opened in my daughter's name by my grandmother in 2011. You were listed as a secondary custodian for emergency access. You used that access to transfer the funds to an account registered under the name of an entity that Garrett's wife's family controls. I paused. That account, I have been informed by the Financial Crimes Unit, is currently frozen as part of a criminal investigation into financial elder abuse and custodial fund misappropriation. My mother's hand, resting on the table, curled very slowly into itself, the way a hand does when it's trying to hold something and there is nothing to hold. That was for her future, my mother said. Her voice was something I had not heard from her before, stripped of the usual architecture of it, the managed brightness, the careful tones, just a voice. I was going to put it somewhere safer. Kevin said. Kevin Tran stood up from the table. I need to speak with outside counsel before this continues, he said. He was not looking at my mother when he said it. He walked out of the conference room. He did not come back. The room was very still for a moment. Garrett looked at the door Kevin had walked through. Then he looked at his mother. Then he looked at me, and in that look was something I had not expected, not defiance, not the practiced composure he'd worn at dinner. It was close to recognition. The particular look of someone who has understood all at once that the ground they were standing on is not the ground they thought it was. Mom, he said softly. She didn't answer him. James Whitfield, at the end of the table, quietly turned to the next page of his summary and waited. Linda gave it another 10 seconds. Then she set a third document in the center of the table. This is a proposed settlement agreement. It includes the full restoration of Claire's custodial account, $28,000, plus accumulated interest. It includes the reinstatement of the original will amendment clause, voiding the deed modification in its entirety and restoring Claire's position as secondary beneficiary of the Kentucky property under the original terms. It includes a full accounting of all estate transactions submitted to the probate court within 60 days. And it includes Mr. Scott and Ms. Scott's written acknowledgement that the deed modification was filed in error. Garrett's lawyer was already reviewing the document. His pen was moving. Garrett looked at it. And if we don't sign? The civil proceeding continues, Linda said. The financial crimes investigation continues independently and is outside our control. The forensic report goes into the court record. Kevin Tran's professional conduct review, which has already been initiated with the Ohio State Bar, continues. She said this without inflection, the way you state things that are already true. Lena had not been in that room, she hadn't been invited, and I later learned she had not been told the meeting was happening, which told me something about how much Garrett had been managing her knowledge of all this. But she called me that evening. She asked if I could talk. I said yes. She was quiet for a moment. I didn't know about Claire's account, she said. I want you to know that. I knew about the estate thing. I thought it was legal reorganizing. I didn't know about Claire's money. Her voice was careful, not defensive. She was telling me the truth. I could hear it. I know you didn't, Lena. Is she okay, Claire? She's okay. Another pause. The entity registered under my mother's name. Garrett told me it was for tax purposes. I signed a formation document 2 years ago because he asked me to. I didn't know what it was for. I didn't say anything to that. I'm talking to my own attorney tomorrow, she said. Good, I said. That's the right thing to do. The settlement agreement was signed 11 days after the conference room meeting. Every term in Linda's document held. The deed modification was voided. The Kentucky property was relisted under the original ownership structure, with Claire's secondary beneficiary position reinstated per my grandmother's handwritten amendment. The full $28,000 plus interest was returned to Claire's custodial account within 30 days, transferred directly, and documented with the probate court. The financial crimes investigation proceeded on its own timeline, outside my control, as Linda had said it would. I was not involved in those decisions. What I know is what became a matter of public record. Garrett entered into a deferred prosecution agreement with the State Financial Crimes Unit in August of that year, contingent on full financial restitution and 3 years of supervised compliance. Kevin Tran's license to practice law in Ohio was suspended for 14 months following a disciplinary proceeding. My mother was not charged. The investigators determined she had acted under Garrett's direction, without full understanding of the criminal elements involved, a conclusion I have my own private thoughts about, but which I have chosen to accept. Garrett and Lena separated in September. She filed quietly, without drama, with her own attorney. The financial planning firm was restructured. The entity registered under her mother's maiden name was dissolved. Last I heard, Garrett had taken a salaried position with an investment firm in Cleveland. He and I don't speak. I don't expect that to change. My mother and I speak occasionally. Not warmly, not the way I used to hope we might. But she called on Claire's birthday in November, and Claire answered the phone and talked to her for 12 minutes about her college applications and the ceramics class she had started taking on Saturday mornings. When Claire handed the phone back to me, she shrugged in the way she does, not dismissive, just practical. She asked if she could come to graduation, Claire said. What did you tell her? I said maybe. That's enough for now. It was. The Kentucky property sold the following spring at a value that put Claire's trust portion at $68,000, held by Linda's firm as trustee until Claire's 25th birthday, exactly as my grandmother's amendment had specified. The 529 account I had established separately continued growing. By the time Claire started college that fall, a state university with a strong architecture program that she had chosen entirely herself, her financial foundation was as solid as I had spent 3 years making it. She called me on her first day of classes. She said the studio spaces were bigger than she expected, and that her roommate had a cat which wasn't allowed, and that she had found a good coffee place 2 blocks from her building. Mom, she said before we hung up. Yeah, that thing you did. All of it, I know it took a long time. I thought about 2 years of silence, about James Whitfield's 40-page report, about Linda's conference room and Kevin Tran walking out the door and the way my mother's hand had curled closed on the table. It was worth it, I said, and that was true. Not because of the money, although the money mattered, because money for a college student is safety and options and the ability to say no to things that aren't right for you. It mattered because my grandmother had intended it, had written it in her own hand, and had trusted that it would reach my daughter. And it did. I don't hate my mother. I'm not sure I ever stopped loving her, in the complicated way you love people who have repeatedly chosen against you. But I have stopped waiting for her to be something she isn't, and there is a particular freedom in that which I didn't expect. It feels less like loss than like setting down something heavy you didn't realize you were still carrying. That hotel parking lot at 2:17 in the morning, me in the dark with my phone, my daughter whispering from a precinct landline, the warrant for records that had been set in motion by a forensic accountant doing his job, that was not the beginning of anything. It was the moment when something that had been building quietly for 3 years finally surfaced into the open air where everyone could see it. I'd been ready. That's the part they never accounted for. So, did I go too far or not far enough? Tell me in the comments.